Seventh chords can be understood as either a triad plus a seventh over its root, or a triad with an additional third stacked on top of its fifth. Seventh chords can be written on 4 consecutive staff lines or 4 consecutive spaces. When a seventh chord is stacked in thirds, the lowest note is called the root, followed by the third, the fifth, and the seventh. Like triads, seventh chords are classified by quality depending on the qualities of the triads and sevenths they contain. As with triads, you can refer to a seventh chord by its root and quality. For example, an E minor 7 chord. Seventh chords can be fully diminished, half-diminished, minor, dominant, major, or minor major. In classical music, the seventh of a chord is a tendency tone that always resolves down by step. In other genres like jazz and popular music that evolved later in history, the seventh of the chord is used freely, both in how it is approached and resolved. So when analyzing music and labeling seventh chords, make sure to consider the genre of the music. Let's go over each chord and see how they're built and the quality of the triad and the quality of the seventh that they contain. The fully diminished seventh. So we start with the diminished chord, which is a series of minor thirds, and then add a diminished seventh from the root. So the notes are E, G, B flat, and D flat, all a minor third apart. Take a listen. The next type of seventh chord is the half-diminished seventh chord. So similar to the fully diminished chord, we start with a diminished triad, and from the root we add a minor seventh. Notice the notes are E, G, B flat, and D. Take a listen. Now I covered these a little bit more extensively in the diminished video I made, and how composers use diminished chords. Go check that out if you'd like to see how composers use these chords in their compositions. The next chord is the minor seventh chord. We start with the minor triad, and then we add a minor seventh from the root. The notes are E, G, B, and D. Take a listen. The most used seventh chord is the dominant seventh chord. To build a dominant chord, we start with a major triad, and then from the root we add a minor seventh. The notes of an E dominant seventh chord are E, G sharp, B, and D. Take a listen. And when we see this chord appear in music, we know that it is a 5 chord that most likely will resolve to either the established tonic or a newly established tonic. The next seventh chord we will talk about is the major seventh chord. In classical music, in the Baroque, classical, and Romantic era, it is a pretty rare chord. You might see it make an appearance, but it most likely will be classified as an appoggiatura. So we start with the major triad, and from the root, we add a major seventh. The notes are E, G sharp, B, and D sharp. Take a listen. The last seventh chord we will go over is the minor major seventh chord. This is a rare chord in the world of classical music, but a standard minor chord in jazz. To construct this chord, we will start with an E minor chord and add a major seventh from the root. The notes are E, G, B, and D sharp. Take a listen. So the next question is, how are these chords used? And the answer is in a variety of ways. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how each one of these chords is used and how the seventh resolves down by step. Each of these seventh chords inherently carries tension due to the added seventh, which seeks resolution downwards in stepwise motion. Let's explore how composers utilize the fully diminished seventh chord. An illustrative example can be found in Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 8, Pathétique, within its opening bars. Beethoven strategically employs the fully diminished seventh chord to heighten tension, promptly resolving each, but swiftly transitioning to another diminished seventh chord. For instance, in measure 1, we observe an F-sharp fully diminished seventh chord resolving to a G major chord. Notice how he suspends the fully diminished seventh chord before it resolves. And following the rule of how sevenths resolve, the E flat of this chord resolves downward by stepwise motion to D. This tension and resolution pattern persists throughout the piece, demonstrating Beethoven's mastery in prolonging resolution. Moving on to the half-diminished seventh chord, similar to the fully diminished chord, the triad itself carries tension. An excellent example is Mendelssohn's Wedding March from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Despite the joyous occasion, Mendelssohn expertly intertwines anticipation and anxiety, and surprising listeners with an F-sharp half-diminished seventh chord. This swiftly transitions to a B major triad, balancing tension and brightness. And that's such a great way of showing what a wedding can feel like, where it's happiness and anxiety and anticipation and joy. Take a listen. Next up is the minor seventh chord. The minor seventh chord is a frequently utilized chord that plays a crucial role in setting up the arrival of the dominant chord. A typical chord progression from the Baroque or Classical era is the 2-7, 5-7, 1 chord progression. In the opening bars of Bach's Prelude No. 1 from the Well-Tempered Clavier, we observe such a progression. The first measure establishes the tonic center of the piece, followed immediately in measure 2 by a D minor 7 chord. This chord introduces a subtle amount of tension, just enough to propel the harmony towards the dominant 7 chord. This progression culminates with a transition to a G7 chord in the next measure, leading back to the tonic C major in measure 4. Let's listen to how Bach employs this minor 7th chord. As mentioned previously, the dominant 7 chord stands out as the most frequently used 7th chord due to its ability to facilitate tonic cessation, establishing or transitioning to a new tonic. Similar to the fully diminished and half-diminished 7th chords, the dominant 7th chord features two tendency tones, the 7th, which resolves down by step, and the leading tone, which often resolves up by step. We'll examine the transition towards the development section in Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 8, Pathétique, where he employs a series of dominant 7 chords to establish new tonics, a technique frequently utilized by Beethoven to modulate to distant keys. Beginning with an E-flat major chord, Beethoven introduces alternating thirds to create movement. Adding the 7th, D-flat, in the following measure sets up tension, eventually resolving to an A-flat chord, where the D-flat resolves down to C. The leading tone of the E-flat dominant 7 chord G resolves upward to A-flat. Immediately after, a C dominant 7 chord appears, signifying a shift to a new tonic. He resolves the C dominant 7 chord to F minor, where E, the leading tone, goes up to F, while the 7th of the chord, B-flat, resolves down to A-flat. As the progression ascends, Beethoven employs stepwise motion, utilizing a C minor and another F minor chord before transitioning to an F dominant 7 chord, noted by an E flat in the bass clef. This F7 chord resolves to a B flat major chord, with E flat resolving down to D and the leading tone A resolving up to B flat. This sequence of dominant 7 chords seamlessly facilitates modulation and harmony changes within Beethoven's composition. Take a listen. Shifting our focus to the major 7th chord, a notable example is Erik Satie's Gymnopédie No.1, where major 7th chords are used for their sound rather than functional harmony, evoking a mix of happiness and longing. For an example of a minor major 7th chord, I was unable to find any that fit the requirements of how a 7th acts, meaning a 7th resolving down by stepward motion. The only examples I found were unresolved chords in 20th century music, or a minor chord with an appoggiatura like in Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, with a C minor chord and a B natural rising up to C. For all my viewers out there, if you know of a piece, I would love for you to share that with me in the comments and let me know so I can include that when I revisit 7th chords. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to check out some of our other videos. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to be up to date with our newest videos. Thank you.